All right. Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us here. I'm Doug Harris, professor at Tulane and director of the Education Research Alliance for New Orleans, or ERA New Orleans for short. In case you're not familiar with us, ERA New Orleans, we've been around for about 6 years now, and our mission is to provide objective, rigorous, and useful evidence about New Orleans schools. And one of the reasons we like to do that is it really provides a jumping off point for really interesting conversations about important topics. So the evidence itself is important in what we find, but I think this is going to be a good example today of how it generates conversation and gets us thinking about important issues. This is a project that we're going to talk about today that we actually started all the way back in 2016, which seems like light years ago given current circumstances. We had been doing a lot of work on student test scores and graduation rates and other outcomes that are commonly measured in the education system and that are important in their own right. But we kept getting feedback, which we agreed with, that we needed to get beyond that. We needed to understand what was really happening in the schools, and in particular, to get the students' perspective on what was happening. They're the ones who we're ultimately there to serve, and they're the ones then whose perspectives we have to really understand how schooling works, what's working and what's not working. So we organized a community group, many different organizations. If you read the report, they're all listed in there. A wide variety of groups that participated in developing the survey and deciding what we should be asking students. We also talked to students about what we should be asking, what's most important to them, and then administered it in a sample of schools that was representative of the city as a whole, and released a report a couple of months back with results, and have been anxiously awaiting doing this event so we could discuss it further and have that larger conversation beyond the report itself. So really glad to be here, glad to have this event, and thanks to the panelists. So I'm just going to turn it over to our moderator, Kenny Francis, and then he's going to take it from there. So Kenny is an educator and a child advocate who previously taught in both pre-K and kindergarten in several New Orleans schools. He later served as director of school support and school improvement at the Orleans Parish School Board. He's currently director of policy and advocacy for Agenda for Children, the state's largest child advocacy nonprofit. He's originally from Brooklyn, New York, and he received his undergraduate degree from University of Virginia. So Kenny, I'm going to turn it over to you. Take it away.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks for having me. I'm glad to be y'all's second choice. Sorry, Dr. Kasner couldn't be here. I have the pleasure of first introducing Lindsay, who's going to be giving an overview of the findings before we get into the panelists and the questions. Just before we jump in, if you have questions, if you're watching this live, feel free to put them in the chat and they will pop up for me, and I'm happy to ask them as we go along. And with that, I'm going to introduce Lindsay. Dr. Lindsay Bell Wexler is the lead author of the Voices of New Orleans Youth Report. She is Associate Director of Research at the Education Research Alliance for New Orleans and leads the center's local research practice partnerships. Her research examines student and parent experiences in both the New Orleans public school system and early childhood education. And from that, I'll let you take it from here, Lindsay.
Thanks, Kenny. Hi, everybody. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today and to everybody who's watching on the live stream. As both Doug and Kenny said, the goal of today's event is really to hear conversation from members of the community and reactions to the findings here. But I do want to go through quickly, and I'll give you the high points of the report so that everybody knows what the main findings are. And then, of course, you can read the full report at our website. All the figures that I'm going to show you today are in that report. So if you want to follow along there or refer back to them, they're all there for you. Sorry, just a minute delay while we get the slides up on the screen. So while I'm waiting on the slides, thanks so much. I want to acknowledge both Doug Harris and Elisa Gary, who are my co-authors on this report, who both made major contributions. Doug, of course, had the vision for this project for many years, convened the community steering group that guided the project, and then Elisa Gary, who's an analyst with us, did a lot of the work to analyze the data and put together the report that led to these findings. So thanks to both of you. So first, I'm going to give a quick overview. So this survey, as we mentioned, was conducted in response to community questions and pushback about measuring only test scores and graduation outcomes, and really trying to get a better understanding about what students' experiences are like in their schools. The content of the survey was heavily guided by our community steering committee so that it could be most responsive to their need for information on what was happening in schools and in communities. We conducted this survey in the 2018-19 school year with middle and high school students, and ended up with a sample of about 3,800 students between 6th and 11th grade from 21 schools. Schools did have to opt into the survey. This was not mandatory or required. So it's not statistically representative of all New Orleans schools. There may have been reasons that schools decided to participate or not, but I will say that our survey sample is very similar demographically to the public school student population as a whole. And we had a really wide variety of schools from all school performance score levels from A to F and from all areas of the city. So the findings that I'll show you today are from 4 different domains that we've measured. First, we asked students about their perceptions of their teachers. We asked them about the climate in their schools, their own academic beliefs and behaviors, and then some measures of experiences outside of their schools. And what you'll see on the figures are the percent of students who marked that they agreed or strongly agreed with the questions being framed positively. So higher percentages means more students who feel positively about that area. So this figure here is showing our findings for 7 different components of teacher quality. What you'll see here are blue bars representing the percent of students who agreed that their teacher was doing well in that area in New Orleans, in our New Orleans surveyed sample. The red bars are from a national comparison group. So for example, that first pair of bars, you'll see that 50% of the time, New Orleans students agreed with items asking them if they felt like their teacher cared about them and understood what was going on with them, compared to 63% of the time in the national comparison group that students agreed that their teacher cared about them. So one big takeaway here from this graph is obviously that in New Orleans, we're seeing students rate their teachers on average lower across these domains relative to our national comparison group. One exception there is in challenge, the sixth row. New Orleans students do rate their teachers highly in holding high expectations and in challenging them at a similar rate to our national comparison group. But we see some large gaps in other areas, particularly in classroom management, Captivate, and care. We also broke down our findings into comparisons by different racial groups. So here, what you're going to see on these slides are the differences between how the Black students in our surveyed sample responded and the white students in our surveyed sample, all public school students here in New Orleans. So the blue bars are representing the percentage of the time that Black students agreed with items in these measures, and the yellow dots are representing white students' responses. So you'll see in 4 out of these 7 domains, we do see a significant difference. The asterisk there denotes that there's a significant difference between Black and white students' responses, with particularly large gaps in 2 areas. One is confer, which means that the student feels like their teacher values their ideas and wants their contributions. And then classroom management, we also see a very large gap there between Black and white students' perceptions. Here you see average responses across our sample for 6 measures of school climate. So what you see here is that for measures of safety and fairness of discipline, equitable treatment, we do see a large majority of students answering positively that they do feel like those that discipline is fair, that their schools are safe. We see a lower percentage agreeing that they feel emotionally safe, which is a measure of feeling like you belong in your school community and you're comfortable there, and also in the comfort of the physical environment. So here again, even though we have on average positive responses for many of these domains, we do see a fairly large gap between Black and white students again, particularly in measures of physical and emotional safety. We see about a 20 percentage point gap in some of these areas. Here are averages for academic beliefs and behaviors. So what we see here is that a large majority of students value their education. They have a growth mindset, which means that they believe that their success is due to effort. But we do see lower rates of students feeling like they are successful in controlling their behaviors and in prioritizing academics when they need to. Academic behavior meaning things like doing your homework, studying when you need to before doing other activities. We also see that students in New Orleans have really high aspirations for college. So 3/4 of students marked that they believe that they would complete college. A slightly lower, but still majority of students agreed that they believe that their teacher believes that they will get a college degree. Here again, we do see some racial disparities, though not across the board. We see Black and white students rating themselves similarly in how much they value education and how much they believe that effort pays off. We do see larger gaps in succeeding in academic behaviors and rating themselves highly in self-control. And then in college aspirations, we do see a gap again, although Black students in New Orleans, still a very large majority of them believe that they will get a college degree. Out-of-school experiences are measures we ask students specifically not related to the school that they're attending, but experiences outside of school and in their neighborhood. So here we see that a majority of students say that they feel safe in their neighborhood. They're not reporting specific experiences of discrimination that we ask them about. They feel like they have social support and an adult that they can trust. But only half, just under half of students said that they feel safer in the presence of police. Here again, we see racial disparities in the direction that you would expect. White students were more likely to say that they feel safe in their neighborhood, that they have not experienced any of the forms of discrimination. And then here we see a very, very large discrepancy in what Black and white students reported in their feelings of safety in the presence of police, with 70% nearly of white students reporting that they feel safer versus only 40% of Black students. And one thing to highlight here is that we asked students about their participation in social activities outside of school, like engagement in social clubs or church groups or extracurricular activities that aren't part of school, and community service activities, which could be formal or informal activities. It included things like helping neighbors without pay or participating in more formal service. And we see Black students reporting participation in those social groups and service activities at a much higher rate than white students. So a few overarching conclusions from our findings here. We do see the majority of students feel challenged. They have high aspirations, and most of them do feel safe in their schools and neighborhoods. But New Orleans teachers were consistently rated lower than a national comparison group, particularly on measures that relate to connecting with students, as classroom management and confer and value domains. And then, of course, across the board, we see that Black students reported more negative experiences both in and out of schools, particularly on measures that were related to physical safety and psychological safety. And with that, I'll turn it back to Kenny. Looking forward to hearing everyone's reactions.
Thanks, Lindsay. With that, before we get into the questions, I'm going to do a brief intro of each of the panelists so that everyone knows who they are. Starting first with Jason Rogers Williams. You would know him as the president of our city council here in New Orleans. He also chairs the Criminal Justice and Smart Cities committees. He grew up in New Orleans and Atlanta, Georgia, and is a graduate of Tulane undergrad as well as Tulane Law School. He is the founder of the Jason Rogers Williams and Associates, where he serves as a criminal defense attorney. He's also on the board of the Innocence Project of New Orleans. Jason served as a judge for the Orleans Criminal District Court in 2003, and he's running in the November election for Orleans Parish District Attorney. Thanks for being with us today, Councilman.
Glad to be here.
I like your glasses, they're great.
Thank you, man. I knew I was going to see you, had to up my game.
I appreciate that, appreciate the respect. Next, we have Caitlin Wills, who is the assistant principal at Eleanor McMain High School. which is part of the Inspire NOLA Charter School Network. She started her teaching career here in New Orleans 9 years ago as a special education teacher at Edna Carr High School. She graduated from George Washington University School of International Affairs with a concentration in African Studies. She also studied at Suffolk University in Dakar, Senegal, where she taught English to local high schoolers. Thanks for being with us today, Katie. Do we have Katie? Oh, she's having some technical issues. So there's going to be a little bit of delay, but she's going to be able to join us. So I'm going to move on to Dr. Govan. Dr. Rashida Govan is the Executive Director of the New Orleans Youth Alliance, which is part of the steering committee for the Citywide Youth Survey. She's also the founder of Project Butterfly New Orleans, a rites of passage program for African-American girls. She is an educator and activist and writer who has worked for more than 20 years in education and youth development. Dr. Govan is a graduate of the University of New Orleans, where she earned her PhD in education administration and is an alumna of Morgan State University. Thanks for joining us, Rashida. Rashida, you're on mute, just so you know.
Hi, it's good to see you.
Good to see you. It's like doing a panel with all my old friends. This is great. As much as I'm not able to see y'all in person. Next, we have Nalia Weber, the Executive Director of Orleans Public Education Network. It's dedicated to disrupting education practices that negatively impact Black students in their intersections in the U.S. and beyond. She holds a double BA magna cum laude from Sweetbriar College and the MA from Teachers College, Columbia University, where she focused on racialized school policies and practices. Currently, Nalia is reimagining the focus of Open to unapologetically place the needs of Black children and their needs at the forefront of education policy and community conversations. Open is also part of the steering committee of the Citywide Youth Survey. Thanks for being with us, Nalia.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, and then, see, we finally got Katie. Katie, you want to say hello to everyone and take yourself off mute?
Sure. Hi, guys. Grateful to be here and grateful for the work that's been done to gather this research. It's really, really important.
And last, but certainly not least, the most important person on our panel, Damon McDonald, is a native New Orleanian who graduated this year from Livingston Collegiate Academy. Congratulations, first of all, where he was the class president and founded the Black Student Union. Go on, young brother. He has been a fellow at the New Orleans Youth Alliance and Orleans Public Education Network, and also served as an advisory council member for New Orleans School Board. He will be attending Illinois Wesleyan University this fall with a posse. Is that the way you say that? Posse scholarship. I'm going to ask you what that is in a little bit. Welcome, Damon. So excited to have you on here.
Thank you.
So before we jump into questions, I want to first ask you, what is the Posse Scholarship and are you excited about college?
Yeah, so the Posse Scholarship is a merit-based leadership scholarship to one of four Posse schools, and I'm going to Illinois Wesleyan, and I will be studying marketing.
Congratulations. I'm very, very excited for you. I'm going to start with you for our first question. So our first question is based off of what Lindsay just talked about in the report. Are the findings of the study consistent with your experiences as a student in schools in our city? And did anything about the report really surprise you about what your classmates were saying?
Not really. I think that once you broke it down by race, and it became very clear how accurate the data represented my experiences or my peers' experiences in New Orleans schools.
I'm going to jump over to Rashida for the same question. Rashida, did anything jump out about the study, and is it consistent with what your experiences in New Orleans public schools and working in them have been?
Yeah, so I agree with Damon. I wasn't necessarily surprised. I think that some of the data was jarring regardless. So whether I was surprised or not, it was unfortunate to see. For me, particularly the piece around care and the components of physical and emotional safety, I was really disturbed that African American students are having such a different experience than their counterparts. And I think the other piece that just, especially due to what is happening in the world right now, what's been happening, is that experience or their perceptions of law enforcement or their feelings of safety around law enforcement, that really grabbed me. So I think those are the things that stood out to me the most, but they also align very much with a lot of the work that I've done on educational equity in New Orleans, looking at how our students are just by and large having a vastly different experience depending on what race they are in the district.
Naya, same question for you. What jumped out to you about the study?
Well, like Damon and Rashida, I wasn't necessarily surprised by the responses. I think, though, that what is important for this study is to put it in context, right? So Black students, I say this all the time, you're talking about public education in New Orleans, you're talking about Black children. They don't make up just the majority of students in the public school system, they make up a super majority of students in the public school system. And not only that, not only do white students make up a minority, but they're concentrated in a minority of schools. And so I think looking at the Black experience in the New Orleans public schools gives you a better sense of of what the experience really is. And we really need to be paying attention to the experiences of Black children if we want to improve the entire system as a whole.
Over to you, Katie. As a current administrator and former teacher, what jumps out about this study to you?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think, unfortunately, a common thread at this point is disappointed but not surprised. Is my general thought about a lot of this. I was surprised by some of them being higher than I would have thought, which is encouraging. Specifically, I'm thinking about kids being able to synthesize and integrate ideas, and also them feeling like the work was relevant to their lives. 70%, that's higher than I think there has been a significant push specifically from the teachers and students to make work more relevant and to measure that more seriously. I think often if something isn't easily measured, we don't focus on it enough. So I was encouraged to see those numbers moving. But in terms of the classroom management numbers, a lot of that is pretty on par with what I've seen. I think it's also tempting to look at numbers in the 60s or 70s and feel good about them. And I just would push us all to remember that if we're looking at a 67% figure in terms of safety, that means that 37% of our kids don't feel safe, which is not acceptable.
Councilman, over to you. So as one of our city leaders, what jumps out to you about this study, and what does it make you think about? You're on mute, by the way, Jason.
I was not surprised by the findings. I was surprised at how little things have changed from the 90s when I was in school, and what this research would have shown in the 70s and the 80s as well. I think the thing that probably was most alarming is how many of these findings, I believe, are reflective of the trauma that kids are dealing with, and generational trauma. I mean, like parents who have been exposed to trauma, raising kids that are dealing with it, that lack of safety sort of plays out in all ways in terms of that self-control, the classroom control with teachers. And I really think, it has just been the elephant in the room for so long. I'm just shocked that we have not been able to address it specifically in a way to bring these numbers down more.
And I would agree with that. I would say that, being able to measure things like this is part of it, which I think is a part of what all of you guys said, that as much as we look at student achievement data, as much as we look at mastery of standards, looking at the actual lived experiences of our students in their schools, in their own words, is just as important metric. And I would go even as far as say that it should be part of how we measure the effectiveness and accountability of our schools. So with that, I want us to jump into some of the findings. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to sort of give an overview of a key finding, ask a question, and ask you guys for your reactions to it. I'm going to invoke some teacher privilege here, since haven't gotten to teach a classroom in a while. If you want to respond, please raise your hand. If no one responds, I am very comfortable with wait time, so I will awkwardly wait till one of you talks. But I don't think with this group that we'll have that issue. So first finding I want to get into is New Orleans teachers scored high in terms of being able to challenge their students, with a majority of students saying that they felt challenged by their teachers, but low in terms of classroom management. Black students were found to be rating their teachers significantly lower than white students did, especially when it came to teachers valuing their ideas, showing that they care about students, and fostering an orderly and respectful classroom behavior. So my first question for y'all is, there's a significant gap between students feeling that their teachers are challenging them. About 70% of students said that. And the gap between that and them feeling captivated, which was only about 47% of students of them. What does this say to you about our current culture of teaching in schools, and what implications for teacher training and evaluation does this have for you? So we'll start with Nalia, then we'll go to Katie there.
I'll make my remarks brief. This particular section I had a bit of a qualm about, because it had all these C's, right? Caring, I don't have it in front of me, but it was like caring and like a lot of C's, right? In terms of what C that was missing, which is content, right? I think it's hard to do all of those things, to engage students, to be enthusiastic with them, to show that you care about their ideas and to challenge them when you're not a content expert or even a content enthusiast, right? I mean, it is the case that you just because you know something, it doesn't mean that you can teach it, but it is also the case that you can't teach something that you don't know. And I think that we often don't include in our conversations with our teaching, maybe because of the nature of the majority of our teaching workforce that are teaching in areas that are not necessarily their content areas or things that they specialize in college, that we kind of like put that to the side. But I think that needs to be brought into the conversation, and matching. It's a very different experience. For example, when I was in high school and I had a literature teacher who was actually writing a book, right? Versus a teacher who might have had a scripted lesson plan in front of them. And so I think that we need to, as part of the teacher quality, I think that we do need to go back into what do our teachers know and how well do they know it? And I think that doesn't explain all of those things, but I think that it can enhance a lot of those other things that we're looking at for teacher quality. And we do know that, for example, that there is a concentration of highly, teachers that have been in their field for a very long time. Those teachers are concentrated in the A and B rated schools. Whereas in our C and lower rated schools, we have teachers that have fewer years of teaching experience under their belt. And I do wonder to the extent to which that impacts the students' experiences in their classrooms.
Over to you, Katie. What were you going to add?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think on a different note, and I just want to say that I'm speaking for myself and not any organization or anything. I think there's a really obvious correlation between the 38% of students who think that their teachers foster an orderly environment and the 50% of students who feel like their teachers care about them. I think a big shift, we spend so much time. I've worked with multiple teacher preparation programs, run sessions. I know what's going in front of teachers in several different types of preparation programs. We spend a ton of time talking to teachers about behavior management. Certainly the issue isn't that we're not talking about behavior management enough. I actually think it's the opposite. I think we spend too much time talking about behavior management and not enough time speaking about building relationships. There's a shift that happens when you run your classroom, when you're looking around your classroom as you teach and you're asking, are they behaving versus are they learning? I worked with one new teacher several years back, and he had a student who I actually grew to know personally afterwards. And he just had this whole idea about that. I have to tell him to sit up all class. I have to tell him to take off his hood. I said, humor me for 2 days. Every time you speak to this child, only talk to him about his work. Walk over and say, hey, do you know how to start question number 2? All right, you got it. And then if you want, tag on, could you sit up for me? Kids are at school to learn. When we focus on their learning, and behavior is only a topic of conversation insofar as, hey, I'm worried about what you're doing right now because it's making it harder for you to learn. Or look, I know you care about the other people in this room. When you do that thing, it makes it harder for them to get their education. And I know that's what you're here for, and I know that's what your parents sent you here for, right? I think we spend too much time talking about behavior. And I think a lot of issues that we address as behavior issues are actually academic concerns, where kids' behavior is indicating an academic issue.
Let's go to Rashida.
Thank you. I agree with a lot of what has been said. I think the one thing I just want to center in this conversation is that whether you understand the content that you're teaching or not, caring is free. And if it's not at the heart of your work, if that's not where you start the work from, then we're going to have problems. I think what Katie said about relationships is really important. In my own research on a high school in the area, I found that they spent so much time focused on discipline and so little time on relationships. They just had like a really chaotic year. They were great. In some cases, they were really strong in the content, but just never really prioritized relationships. And so I'm seeing that as like a trend. When you're looking at this data and it says that they feel challenged, but they don't feel cared for, what is one without the other? And until I think educators get the support for centering care in their teaching, or they get that idea just internalized for themselves, that we're going to continue to see that. I also think, to Jason's previous point around issues of trauma, that is like a really significant issue. So if you're looking at this data and they're saying they feel unsafe, right? And if we get to this space now, I have to be alert for this exchange of ideas and stuff, like you're just gonna miss it, right? We're not addressing the real issues. I think the last thing I wanted to say about this is on the confer issue, like feeling like your ideas matter. I see that a lot, and I don't know if Damon has anything to add to this, but I work with young people a lot, and I find that when we're asking them, what are your ideas? What do you think about that? Sometimes it's a cold silence for like a minute, because oftentimes my experience is that people don't ask young people what they think. Mm-hmm. And it's disturbing to me, because in school, that's where you should be having this exchange of ideas, where you should be developing that muscle to be a critical thinker and an independent thinker. And I don't feel like that's rewarded or supported in schools. So I think that's just something, particularly for Black students, that is particularly important, because we focus on compliance, but not on their intellectual development in a way that will promote them being independent thinkers.
Jason, I didn't want to get to Damon and ask a young person what they think.
I wanted to, I was treading lightly on this answer because I'm not an educator, and I believe it is truly one of the toughest jobs in the world. But knowing the content of what you are teaching is not nearly as important as knowing the audience you are trying to speak to. Just as a litigator, or if I'm talking to a jury, if I'm talking to an audience, I need to know them. I need to understand them, and I need to know how they are coming and receive, and what position they're in to receive that information. And I can tell you, as a criminal defense attorney, young people are getting policed everywhere. And so if the one person who is supposed to care about what they have to say is starting to police them before they start teaching them, then they shut down, right? And like the amount of security that is present before you even get into a classroom, and what that feels like, the space does not, it feels like more policing. And I think when you look at what's happening in the world right now, we've gotta meet kids where they are. And I don't think that's happening.
Thank you for that comment, Jason. As the saying goes, you can't teach them if you don't know them. Damon, what are your reactions to this?
To Jason's point, like, if a lot of our teachers come in, or my experience with teachers, they have been predominantly women and predominantly white. So they come into the school with an assumption or a bias, and they use that when they're teaching us and when they are disciplining us. Like, I know that teachers who are not from here, teachers who don't look like me, are usually the ones who would send my peers out at higher rates than a normal teacher that looked like me. And I also want to hit on what Rashida said, that having a relationship with students is very important. For me, I think the thing that made me most successful in school is that I was able to build relationships with my teachers. Even if, they wasn't as responsive to me, I made it a point, I made it my initiative to like make sure that I know this teacher, I have your number, I know how to email you, I know how to get in contact with you. But most teachers are not like that, and most teachers don't want to build a relationship with these students. And that's why I feel like they would not, perform well, and students don't perceive them as a good role model or a good figure for them.
Thank you for that, Damon. And that's, I think, for any educators that are watching it, that's a very powerful testimony there of how students are feeling about their teachers in the city. And I want to touch on something that Katie said that sort of goes into what Damon just said. Well, we had only 38% of students reported favorably in terms of their teachers' classroom management skills. And you mentioned, Katie, that we spent a whole lot of time on behavior management and teacher training. Having been through teacher training myself, and I know that several people on the call has, it's about a good 2/3, if not more than that, of the type of professional development you get as a teacher. And so to see that number still be so low, despite our enormous focus on classroom management, it tells you something about how we're equipping teachers to go into the classroom and actually be successful with students. So I would love to get y'all's responses of, in thinking about this data point and thinking about our current reality around teacher training. What does this mean for teacher training for y'all? How do we rectify this? Remember, raise your hand. Rashida.
Oh, okay. So, I spend a good bit of time now doing teacher training and professional development, as well as the same work with youth development folks. And I'm also an educator by trade. I've been in the game for a minute. And what I will tell you is what this means is that we're going to have to prioritize relationships. We're going to have to prioritize understanding the students that you're teaching, understanding their culture, and having a level of cultural competence. And beyond that, I think if you understand who your students are and you understand the context in which they operate, then you have to be trained and prepared to respond in kind. So if you know that they're being policed all over the place, if you know what their experiences are with structural racism, then you have to be cognizant of the fact that many of the policies and practices that we execute in schools are actually part of that entire system, part of that experience of oppression for students. So we have to actually train teachers to be cognizant of that, to be aware so that they can shift their practices so that they're more liberatory. So I think that's one part of it. I think if you understood, I'm going to just give you an anecdote. I was watching Ellen because I liked her for a minute, and she did a show about some kids in South Central. And she said to introduce the principal that these kids had a lockdown the day before because there was a gunman loose in the streets. And she said, but they're used to that, right? And I was just like, ma'am, it got glossed over and moved on. But for real, there are many people who operate in spaces with Black and brown kids who think they're just used to it, or they ignore it and act like nothing is happening. So they continue to expect young people to deal with a lot of trauma and show up and be ready to learn. Actually, no, right? A no response is a response. It tells you exactly how much we care about you and regard you. And so our teachers actually have to be trained to respond in thoughtful and appropriate ways to young people who experience trauma. And if you're Black or brown in this country, you are experiencing trauma every day. And even if you're not directly experiencing that trauma, there's an epigenetic impact, right, from the trauma that our parents experience. So what I mean specifically is when our parents experience trauma, some of the impacts of that trauma are passed down to us in our DNA. Like, that is something you have got to understand. And so teachers, I think, I don't want to go hard on them too much because I think they want to respond, but they don't have the tools. And that's what we need to be focusing on.
Katie?
Thanks. Yeah, I think I want to key in on something that Zaman said earlier. He referenced teachers as role models. And I think folks who have taught for any significant amount of time will tell you that is a thing that doesn't get covered in teacher training. And if you're really good at this, I like to think of myself as a decent teacher. And what I can promise you, staying in contact with hundreds of kids at this point, is who I was and how I responded to things. And my values and ethics are what kids will remember significantly more than a story that we read on Thursday at 2 p.m., right? But, if you are not being intentional about that, it's still impacting kids. Everything that you do as an educator, it is the world's, I'm always blown away every year by the trust that people put in us as educators when they turn their kids over to us. It's a huge responsibility. And who you are and the things that you're not thinking about that you're doing out of muscle memory, they impact kids every day, whether you're thoughtful about that or not. So the best educators that I know are people who know themselves, know who they are, and are always thoughtful and have intentionally done work around how that's going to impact their kids. That is an especially important factor for, as Damon said, those of us who do not come from the same environment as our children and do not look like them. The burden is on us because we signed up to go teach somebody else's children, to do the work, to be qualified to do that. And quite frankly, I think it's malpractice if you don't. And children, my favorite people are always, high schoolers are my favorite people in the world, because nobody is going to tell you the truth faster or see through things that are not the truth faster. Children know when you like them, they know when you care about them, and they know when you don't. You cannot fake it. I cannot. And that is just the thing that becomes hard. I can coach a lot of things. You got to know who you are and what your biases are. And that's, again, particularly important for white educators, but that's all educators, because we are all swimming in a really polluted cultural waters, right? We can't, schools are not immune to the biases and all of the isms of our society. They are microcosms of it. I went to an Undoing Racism training at one point that said, if systemic racism is built systemically, so anti-racism has to be equally, if not more so, systemic. So what are the systems that you have? Who do you check in with? How do you be accountable to your kids and ask them how they feel about being in your room? And the last thing I'll say is Dwayne Reed, who's a thought leader in the education community, says, you can't love Black children and fear the adults that they become. So I think we all have to look really closely at ourselves, because the kids know who we are better than we do often.
Thank you for that, Katie. And I'll add that as a former early childhood teacher, the little ones will tell you the truth just as fast. The number of days where my kids, my 4-year-olds, would emphasize the "you look nice today" and emphasize the today part, I can tell you the little ones speak their minds too. Damon, I saw you raise your hand there. What do you want to add? You're on mute.
Yeah, I think something Katie said was very powerful, and she said that that the response to systemic racism has to also be systemic. The way I've seen systemic racism show up in my own experience in schools is through tokenism. A lot of times the administrators would point out these particular students and say, you should be like this person. And I'm a victim. I won't call myself a victim of it, but I've been a tool of it. And I had to recognize that me participating in this system and me saying that, oh, you should behave in this particular way, was not only tokenism, but it was also me playing respectability politics and me trying to get young Black people to behave in this particular way when in reality, they could be whoever they want to be. They don't have to go to college. Like, I remember we had a career pathway discussion the other day, and we talked about how the school doesn't prioritize giving access to all students to alternative career pathways, like through the NOTEP program or the Youth Force NOLA program. And I think that we need to respond to that. Yeah, I just think we need to respond to that.
Jason and Nala, do you guys have anything to add on this one?
Not anything particularly more than what was already been said. I agree with Damon, Katie, and Rashida. But I think that essentially it goes back to our values and assumptions that we bring into spaces. Why do we? Because classroom management often becomes behavior management, and why do we think that Black children have to be managed, or that their behavior has to be managed? And why do we? So that's part of it. Another part of it is, I've seen behaviors that are developmentally appropriate for children to be doing at that age policed. And I've seen kids get sent to detention or suspended for doing something that they're supposed to be doing at the age of 11. And so it is our values and our assumptions and our biases, like Damon said. It is the fact that we're growing up in anti-Black culture around us that impacts how we view and interpret the behaviors of Black children when they're in class, but it's also just our lack of understanding about how humans develop, period, or not allowing space for natural, healthy human development in our schools, and that in turn creating learning environments that are not humane and that are not developmentally appropriate. So I think it's just a combination of all of those things. And we're talking about teacher training. We do need to understand our children as children in context, the political, economic, social context that they're growing up in. But we do need to understand our children as children, right? Black children are children first, right? And we need to understand how to undo racism. And we also need to understand just fundamental principles of child development. That needs to be part of our teacher training as well.
Jason, you have something to add?
Yeah, one thing I would add, and I've had to deal with this myself. My 14-year-old is now, since this COVID break, has grown to be 2 inches taller than me and now wears the same size shoes as me. And part of that institutional racism is that we make young Black males adults and young Black females adults in our brains so much faster than they actually are. And as a criminal defense attorney, I always focus on that sort of brain development. And that also goes to how we're trying to, I guess the way I would say it is that professional development before any kids are in classes has to be unpacking some of what you're bringing from your hometown when you come to New Orleans to teach, and really prioritizing what are the things that need to happen first. And I think it goes to what this panel has been saying, building those relationships and comprehending your kids before you start figuring out what you want to convey to them. Because those first two things can make the rest of it so much easier, I think.
And I just want to sort of really underline the point that several of y'all made there is you think about a reality that we live in where Dylan Roof in the news about him was consistently talked about how young he was and how young and impressionable he was, and basically infantilizing him. And he was about 21 when he committed that crime. Meanwhile, Tamir Rice was 14 years old. And the conversation about his murder was about how he should have known better, how a 14-year-old child should have known better than a grown police officer with years of training. And so I really want folks to think about that and really highlight what several of y'all have said there. And Nadia, thank you for correcting me. I think he was 12. He was even younger than 14. And so I think it's a really important point to make of how we view Black children and how we turn them into adults when they're children. And think about how many kids, middle schoolers or even younger, get the cops called on them for acting out in school, which if it was a white kid, it'd be viewed as a tantrum and they'd be talking about what's going on at home or what help do they need. But with a Black kid, they're getting hauled off in cuffs and getting charged with things like assault for doing something that a child does, act out sometimes, especially if they're not getting what they need. So I really, really thank y'all for bringing up those points. I think it's really important. I want to push us to the next key finding. So the next key finding I wanted to talk about is that sort of what we started talking about here is that about 2/3 of students felt that bullying is not a big problem and that the schools feel safe and that the discipline is fair. But once again, Black students gave a much lower rating on that than white students. And I want to note what Katie already said is that if we're talking about 2/3 of kids feeling safe, that means we're still at almost 40% of kids not feeling safe in our schools, which is a problem. And I specifically want to ask Jason to go first in this because you mentioned something at the beginning of this about how you were kind of taken aback how things haven't changed that much since you were in school in New Orleans in the 90s. And we've had 20 plus years of reform since then.
Yeah, I mean, it really speaks to, a lot of things have changed, but a lot of things just really have not changed at all. And John Lewis wrote, I don't know when he wrote it, but it was in the New York Times today, his last words to the country. He's talking about the millions of people who've been motivated by human compassion and laid down their burdens of division and are demanding respect for human dignity. We really have not done that for children yet, right? And that's what this research and this conversation is what does dignity look like? What does it need to look like? How are the schools built? Are there bars? Are there windows? how many security details, how many metal detectors you go through before you even get to a classroom. And it really speaks to trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma that just goes unaddressed. And this research excites me because just like when we do a disparity study to see who's getting contracts, who's getting business in a city, we know the answers. We have a disparity dashboard to see who's getting arrested more. And Jeff Astor just showed us a graph showing like 50 times the African-American males getting arrested for simple possession of marijuana when we decriminalized it last year. So it shows you what we know, but now that we're measuring it, we can really take aim at those root causes. So yeah, I think we're going to keep coming back to that trauma component, and it's going to keep manifesting itself until we deal with it. When there's one school shooting in one suburban white school, the school shuts down. When a kid sees his parents murdered and has their blood on him the night before, he gets sent to school the next day, and the teachers and administrators may not even know what happened until they see the news the next night and connect those dots.
Katie?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I think also to Congressman Williams' point about sorry, excuse me, Councilman. My bad, not yet. But clearly, you know where my allegiances lie, Councilman. But so to what does this say about our children? I think about this 51% number around the comfort of the physical environment a lot. What does the built environments of our schools say to children? And a lot of the buildings are a lot better than they used to be, but our kids spend so much time. You know, I worked at Carver for a long time. And one of the community members there that I'm close with always talks about the railroad tracks on all four sides around the Desire, and that was never lost on him the entire time that he lived there. So I think built environment is a piece that we need to look at as well. And I also, when I look at this sense of safety number, I think a lot about our queer youth and the rates of suicide, which are 3 times higher nationwide. And I wonder often about, again, how intentionally we tell children, we love you, we love all of you, we're here for you. And we tell folks on the front end, if you're not feeling safe, if you're not feeling comfortable, here's what you do. I think often the burden of reporting bullying and what is happening to you falls on children when we're the adults in the room, right? You can tell on a child's face when they are not having a good day. I've seen kids do so well in all of their classes, and then they get to one class and they're silent. And I think, you know, teachers are, to me, some of the most incredible people on the planet. I think it's the best job in the world. I think it's the hardest job in the world. And I don't want to disagree with Nalia. The content is so important. And you have to know your content well enough that you can notice and spend your limited working memory on looking at the faces and that emotional intelligence piece of what's happening to your kids in front of you. I don't think we are anywhere near where we need to be in terms of providing support for kids so that they can feel safe. I mean, we went home and that was it. You know, if you had a bad day, if somebody was mean to you, at least you could go to your house. Our kids aren't on Instagram, they're on TikTok. It never stops. And so I worry constantly about our kids and how we provide psychological safety for them and how we help them to define themselves in a world where they have such a public presence and they're being defined by so many other people.
Naya?
I guess I wanted to speak to a combination of what Jason and Katie, sorry, I didn't mean to put your names together, mentioned around this concern around the lack of, our young people not feeling as physically safe in the spaces that they've been in. Jason talks about how a lot of things have changed, but a lot have stayed the same. But then Katie mentions also a fact, which is that millions have been poured into the infrastructure of our schools. And what that reminds me of is there's a difference between reform and a radical shift in how we do things. And that's why things look different, but the outcomes are similar, right? We have, I've been in some of these schools. They look great, right? They're completely upgraded. They look really nice on the inside, but they're really an upgraded old school. And when we're saying that we want kids to be prepared for the 21st century, I have a brother that lives in San Francisco. He works for a video game company. And I would go out there and visit him and go visit him at his job. And this space that we're saying that we want to prepare young people to have these kinds of careers doesn't look anything like a traditional school at all. Right? So we have to get past this idea that if we spiffy something up, if we polish it a little bit, right, but we keep it fundamentally intact, that is going to create these radically different outcomes, right? I go into these schools that are new and they have like these, new sunlight and these new facilities, but there's no place for kids to rest. There is, there seems to be not a lot of communal spaces where children can kind of roam freely on their own without, extra supervision. There are no places, it doesn't really feel like a place where you are in community with other folk, right? It just seems like a spiffied up old school, right? And so I think that we need to, if we really want to see radically different outcomes, then we have to do things radically different. We need to reconfigure our spaces so that they encourage the kind of behaviors and the relationships that we want to see between students and teachers, right? And then we also need to, what we were talking about before, radically reimagine and change how we are thinking about our young people. How do you create a space that is physically anti-racist, right? How do you create learning spaces that physically convey that students are just as important as teachers? So I think that we need to go back to the drawing board and really make changes instead of, just reforming what we had before. Reform is not going to get us to radically different outcomes.
I want to add there to the point you're making, Nalia, that if anyone who hasn't read it, there's a great study by UNIFEST called Child-Centered Cities that really talks about this and about reimagining both our public spaces in terms of our city infrastructure as well as our schools into places that are actually more amenable to child development and child safety. Any other thoughts on this topic from Rashida, Daman? Anything to add there?
Yeah, I just want to tell you, as we've progressed in this conversation and started, the more we talk about safety, the more I feel sick in the pit of my stomach. I want to acknowledge what I'm feeling because I think it needs to be articulated loudly that this is a sick situation that we're talking about when we can casually discuss children feeling unsafe in a space that should be one of the safest places for them to dwell. And it's a space where they spend the majority of their day. It's sick, right? To me, to gloss over that. Not saying that that's what we're doing, but this is out here. What are we going? This should be a signal. We should be banging on something. I'm feel sick. I feel a level of anger, and I want to express this because I think it's important for our children to know that there are people who care enough to tear something down for them. That's how I'm feeling. Because this whole thing does need to be disrupted. And I think one of the things that I keep hearing in this conversation is this about the radical reimagination and the built spaces and all of that. None of this can change if young people are not centered in this conversation, meaning no conversation should be had with an architect about how to build a space for children without children actually contributing to that dialogue. Right? If you see wealthy people, I watch a lot of HGTV. You see wealthy people on TV, they're getting a new home. They have a designer come in. They sit down and talk to the kids. What would you like to see? How would you like to? What do you like to do? Do we even, we don't show that type of respect. We don't show that type of respect to our young people. And it shows up in a lot of ways in the built spaces, but also just in our exchanges. And I'm really tired of having this expectation that our children operate in a way that is productive when you're not safe. Scientifically, that's not a reasonable expectation. Nobody is at the top of their game when they're feeling unsafe or they're in fear. This is just something we can't gloss over. It's a significant issue, and it hurts my spirit that our children hurt like that.
Thank you for that, Rashida. Damon, do you have anything to add on this?
Yeah, if you remember, Miss Rashida, like we had this conversation about whenever we do call for radical changes and we say we want things to be different, we're always met with, it's not time, we can't do that, it's too far out. Like young people, I think, are imaginative enough to like think of new solutions, but the adults who ask us these questions don't.
You know what, Zaman? I want to say I think that it is. I don't even know if they don't believe in you. I don't know. I think adults are whack sometimes, and we lack imagination. Like I sat in a room full of people who do work with young people who I know love young people, and we were asked, what vision do we have for what things could be for kids? And the only thing the adults in the room could do was say that the opposite of what currently existed. They had no imagination beyond that. Like, honestly, the only way out of this for all of us is y'all. Like, that's it. And we have to get out of our own way, because I think we allow fear that y'all don't yet have. Hopefully you don't have it, right? We allow fear and all the constraints of the world today to dictate to us a no before we even try. And we can't, I swear to you, we can't do this without your vision. And we do need to get out of the way. That's honestly, adults need to get out of the way.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more there, Rashida. Any other responses to that before we move on? I have one more safety related question. So one more question about school climate and safety that I wanted to address is, and I'm not even going to quote the statistic because it's probably the most obvious finding in this report, that a large majority of children felt unsafe having police officers in their presence and our presence at school. So I'm going to go out on a limb. I'm going to go out on like a place of privilege of limb here and say, you know what? We shouldn't have police in schools. Like I'm not even going to ask y'all whether that should be the question or not. The answer is no, especially when we're talking about schools that are majority Black children, and we already know the over-policing that happens to Black people in this country. So we're going to start this part of the conversation from the place of no, there should not be police in schools. The question I have for y'all is, how do we reimagine this idea of school safety? What does it look like to actually make a school safe that isn't creating another over-militarized, over-policed space that our Black children also have to worry about their safety? Jason?
Well, I think when you look at a legal case, you want to issue spot first and figure out what the issue is. And I think it would go back to the conversation that we were just having from Rashida and from Damon, is we need to hear from young people what makes them feel unsafe, right? And I think when you realize that, it goes to your initial premise here, is the police only heighten that anxiety. And the same would go for security details as well. Any person armed with a badge in that space is not going to make a young African-American feel any safer, right? And I think it also I think about the Superdome and like these grand structures that people create because they want to inspire an experiential event there, right? And so hearing from young people about what those spaces would need to look like to engage them and pull them out of the drama and trauma of their daily lives with their parents in their neighborhoods, what would a school need to look like for that to truly be that space? I don't have that answer. And I think we would want to hear from young people to hear what it is, because with the amount of money we're spending on schools, we certainly could build it and design it. And it would not include a whole lot of draconian authorities walking around to ensure their safety. First of all, police don't prevent any crimes on streets, right? It's all cat and mouse. So the idea that walking a beat in in hallways is somehow going to prevent crime is silly, right? If an officer, and we need to talk about how officers are even called to schools, right? Should you be able to arrest a child on a campus, right? And so we need to have a conversation about how that should happen as well. And we've been having those talks with the police chief recently.
Damon, I want to go over to you because I want to center your voice in this specific part of the conversation. What does school safety look like to you?
I can't even begin to imagine that question, like to think about a new answer to it, because like I've never been able to experience or think about anything differently. Like I remember I brought up like the issue of metal detectors in my school, and it was always like, then what else we're going to do? Like, it wasn't as if there was a different solution. It was as if that was the only solution. And I don't even know. I can't even begin to answer.
And I think that your inability to imagine a different reality says a whole lot about the current reality. Rashida, I see you wanted to add.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing I was talking about, Damon, about how like adults don't have imagination. I believe that you could think of something. But like when I've been talking about what does it look like to just defund the police and abolish the police, and my Black and brown brethren are like, what are you talking about? It's just gonna make it more unsafe. I'm like, really? But we can't change what we have by rebuilding on the same rotten foundation, right? We cannot. And so I start this thinking from, where do I feel safe? And I'm going to say, as a Black woman, I don't feel safe in a lot of places. A lot. I don't feel safe walking to my car from a store. I don't feel safe going for a run. I don't really run. I don't feel safe doing like a lot of things that other people take for granted. When I feel safest, I would say, is with people who I know care about me. I feel safe in spaces that we create for ourselves. Like I really do. Like when Nalia and I, we're doing like some kind of sister circle, I feel super, like that's where I feel like really comfortable because we've designed that space for us, right? I feel safe in spaces where our cultural traditions are being practiced, where there's elders, where there's children, like, because there's always a respect that we show to those different populations. And so I'm just trying to think of, where do I feel safest? And how do we reproduce that in a school setting? Yeah, what does that look like? How does that look different?
Nalia?
I have a lot of ideas and they may come out jumbled. I was having this conversation with someone else that sometimes we don't need to reimagine, sometimes we need to remember. I attended public schools for the majority of my K through 12 career, and in none of them did I go through metal detectors and was I searched. And there were not police officers on campus. And I went to schools in inner cities, Title I schools, all the catchwords for poor and Black. I went to those schools and we did not have police officers there. And this is in the 80s and the 90s. I don't think that we were less violent or less prone to violence. I think that young people were experimenting with drugs and alcohol back then just as much as they are now. There were school fights and there were young people who may have had access to weapons. And even still, I did not go to school like this. So we need to kind of remember and kind of go back. And when did we have this cultural shift that our young people are participating in or perpetuating violence on such a level that we need to have police in schools, right? Where did that come from? And I think we kind of need to go back to that. And when we're talking about safety, again, police officers are reactive, right? They do not prevent anything. Something has to go down first, and then you call them, right? And we need to take a look at that, right? They don't prevent anything. And then also why all conflict is not criminal.
Mm-hmm.
Students can get into a fight. It's conflict. Students can have a yelling match. Students can swing on each other, right? These are opportunities to help young people learn how to deal with conflict in a way that doesn't become physically violent or emotionally or verbally violent. Instead of using these opportunities as growth opportunities, we want to squash it, move them out of the system, move them out of our face real quick, or we call the police on them or a school resource officer, because in fact, and I've seen deans do this, they actually do want to get physical with students. They do want to put their hands on students, but they don't have the authority to. And so they call the SRO, who does have the authority to cuff that student, right? So we have to think about, why do we want to criminalize students? Why do we want to victimize and use physical punishments and threats against students? Why do we want to do that, right? The police are not there because the students need them. The police are there because we want to use them against our young people. Where does that come from? And why is that okay?
Katie, I see you have a lot to add. So go ahead, jump in.
I'm not going to add all the things I'm thinking. I think I agree with so much of what Nalia said, particularly this piece around proactive versus reactive. Again, whether we think of it this way or not, schools are communities. And I love what you said about we need to remember. Communities have managed conflict and disagreements and dishonesty and all of these things since humans evolved, right? We didn't have police for the majority of human existence. And I think this question makes me think a lot about one of the best educators that I've ever had the privilege of working with, who passed away recently, Walter Harris. And when I started at Carver working with Walter Harris, he could tell you which neighborhood every kid lived in. He could tell you which kids were affiliated and which kids weren't. He could tell you who was friends with who. And so Walter Harris never had to call an SRO. He knew his kids well enough to know when something was wrong with them, right? And I don't mean wrong with them like there's something wrong about the child, but when something was going wrong for them. And I think safety always comes from a place of, and I think about your answers, Rashida, about when you feel safe. We feel safe when we're seen and understood. And people who feel safe don't have to fight. People who feel safe don't have to bring weapons to protect themselves, right? And so we're always going to have to go, to your point, Nalia, to this reactive mode if we're not proactively creating a place where kids feel safe. And I can't say, to your point, Zaman, I can't say I've ever seen it. I've seen glimpses. I've seen certain classrooms where kids feel safe. I've seen certain adults that kids always feel safe with and will tell things to. I think there are people who do this and facilitate this and create this. And I think our kids often, I can't tell you how many fights kids stop by just, talking to their peers. I think there are experts around that we just don't listen to.
Thank you for that, Katie. So with that, taking a look at the time, we have a little bit less than 20 minutes left. So we're supposed to be getting to the Q&A part of this from the audience. So if you're out there watching on YouTube or Facebook, or I don't know where else this is also being streamed, if you have a question, put it in your chat box and it'll pop up on my screen and I'm happy to ask it to the panel. And if there aren't any, trust me, I have other questions I can ask. I do want to address one thing I have seen in the comments on here while we've been talking about this specific question around police involvement in schools and officers in schools. A commenter wrote that the Columbine shooting in the 90s played a huge role in the placement of police in schools. And that's why they're there. And I would like to point out a reality here that I want folks to think about as they think about the role of police in schools is we have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on putting police officers in schools, thousands of them in schools since Columbine, and those officers haven't stopped not a single school shooting, not a single one. And as everyone on this panel has said repeatedly over and over and over again, the police are a reactive force that appear after the thing has already been committed. So this idea that we could have stopped violence in schools with police officers has been proven wrong over, Columbine was the late 90s. So it's been over 20 years. So I think that this experiment and this investment has been a failed investment in putting police in schools, and it's time to reinvest those dollars. Rashida, I see you have something to add.
I like that. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I just want to say, like what Nalia was saying about remembering, I can't remember because in my entire school experience, except for K through 6. I had police and security in my school. And I will tell you that happened long before Columbine. I graduated high school in so
You're aging yourself a
in the
little bit.
early 90s. Listen, I'll be 45 this year. And so from the 80s through 93, I had police in my school and they were there before me. So no, this is not, the police in Black schools was not in response to Columbine. I want to be clear about that. They have been policing us since a very long time.
Also, I like to add that, and this happened in Florida very recently. Look at where the school shootings are and look at where they increase the police violence. Look at the demographics of where school shootings tend to be and look at the demographics of the schools where police force tends to be increased. Very different, all right? So I would agree that the school shooting, I don't know what it is, a phenomenon or culture. I mean, we've had school shootings in America since the 70s, really, that there's a disconnect between those events and, the increase of officers and police officers in our schools.
Damon, did you have something you wanted to add?
Damon, you're on mute.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the question about school safety because I don't know why it didn't dawn on me, but I have been in spaces where I felt safe where there were no police officers, there were no adults. When I was an organizer with Rethink, like it was completely youth-led spaces. There was no threat of violence. There was no threat of I felt safe in those spaces. And I remember initially I was like, hey, where are the adults? Where are some sort of protection? And like what everybody has been saying, all the police or SROs are just like props or just I don't know, it's just fake. It provides a fake level of safety that doesn't exist.
Thank you for that, Damon. Jason, do you have something to add?
I want to, not only do we have to reimagine schools and the facilities and what we're delivering to kids, but we also have to reimagine, what is policing? Like at some point we made it the default for everything. Someone is in a mental health crisis, call the police. Someone is in an addiction crisis, call the police. There's a fight at school, something that I would have gotten detention for, a conduct report, call the police, right? And so we have made them the default savior of everything, which puts them in a situation that is not sustainable, that is not healthy. It's not healthy for those police officers, nor is it healthy for the people they're supposed to be serving, because pepper spray, a gun, a baton, a taser, none of those things are adequate responses to a person in crisis or a child. So not only do we have to reimagine what schools look like, but we need to reimagine, what policing looks like. And so if in fact we were to say, well, there's a role for a police officer in a school, does that person need to wear a uniform? Do they need to have a gun, right? Do they need to have some training as a social worker? Like what, and what is policing, right? Walking a beat in the hallway of a school is not policing. You gave us that data, Kenny, and that is very, very accurate. So I really think we've been doing we've been repeating the same things for so long because of laziness and habit, and we've been spending ridiculous amounts of money trying to do the exact same thing with a flashier or shinier space or with new sheetrock.
In response to that, Jason, I want to say a saying that's been going around that I'm sure all of you have heard is that when all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail.
Yes.
I want to note here a message I got from Sharon at the team at ERA that there's for folks who are interested in this more specifically about the conversation around school resource officers. There's some research done by the 74million.org about how school resource officers in white schools see their role as primary to protect the kids from quote outsiders, i.e. school shooters, but school resource officers in Black schools see their role as to protect the kids from each other. And there's a whole lot to talk about related to that. With that, we did get a question from the public, so I do want to ask it since folks are submitting it. So the question here says, would panelists like to see more research related to these issues of safety and policing? And if so, what would that look like? Or do you feel like we don't need more data to inform policy, just better political will among decision makers? Katie?
Yeah, I do not need more data on this. I don't think any of us are on team. We didn't realize this was a problem. I think it's political will. I also think when it comes to safety and policing, I think schools get tasked with solving so many of the ills of society. And schools do a lot, and we are responsible, right? I don't ever want to abdicate any of our responsibility for the children that people trust us to take care of every day. But I also think in the same way that police officers are asked to perform so many roles in society, teachers are as well. I don't know a single teacher that hasn't lost sleep, even teachers who, maybe are not as aligned with the best interests of children as they should be. Even those teachers lose sleep over the safety of our children in New Orleans. And I think this is something that we need to address, not just through schools.
Rashida, I saw you had your hand up. Nope. Naya?
I agree with Katie. We don't need more data. We already know what it is. I would say, though, what we need to do is disincentivize this, and a lot of this is a lot of these policies are tied to money. We're thinking about building prisons and increase and where they're built and the money for these SROs. I think that we need to look at just the whole prison industrial complex and policing in general, and understand that there are financial incentives to increase this police state apparatus, and that schools have become a way to provide the economics and financing behind this. So I think that we need to disincentivize this. I think that we need to shift a lot of the funding that goes towards these things into areas that we know are going to keep kids and families safe. So yeah, we don't need more data. We just need to remove a lot of the money that is invested in this and put it towards children.
Rashida?
Thanks. I had to collect myself. So I don't think this is an issue of political will either, right? Like, not at all. I think that we need to do some unlearning. It's a lot of miseducation about who our children are. I think we talked about it. Jason spoke very eloquently to the point that we don't see our kids as kids. And so we think that they need to be policed. A lot of that is such a deep-rooted belief amongst people who work in Black spaces that has got to be called and brought to the surface and live in Black spaces. So like, I just thinking about some of the dialogues, and I'm going to be controversial if you don't mind, but a lot of the dialogues around that juvenile curfew, like if you just sat back and said, what's the underlying belief that's present in this policy? That we have to hide our kids away, otherwise they're going to commit a bunch of crimes. Like, that mindset says something about what you think about all of our children, not the handful that might have been committing crimes. And then, like, what did they even need? Do we even see them as children once they have done something that we find to be unappealing or inappropriate? Like, we just need
to controversial at all, Rashida. That's the truth.
Well, somebody doesn't like it, whatever. But the other piece is that we have to name that a lot of the narratives, the responses, the policies are rooted in white supremacy. Like, let's just say what it is, right? So when you look at Black people who are addicted to drugs, to Jason's point, we've been criminalizing Black folks, right? So of course, the solution is to call the police, because we don't see the value in our lives and enough to think that we deserve other types of investments. And so, like, we have to really just unlearn who we think Black people are. Not we, because, I think we're glorious people. Up ye mighty race. But we have to really talk about our underlying beliefs about who Black people are. That's just, and brown people, because what we're going to see in New Orleans, as we see a growing population of Latinx people, is the same kind of mistreatment there. And we're seeing, and how I know that will be the case is because even though their suspension rates aren't high right now, they don't look like ours, their graduation rates are looking mighty low. And our English language learners are not being served well. So you're gonna continue to see some responses and reactions to them and interpretations of their behavior as they spend more and more time in these systems. They're going to experience the same thing. So I think we got to unlearn some racist ideas and shift policies and systems from a new way of thinking, which is just kind of sad to say, a new way of thinking. Something other than anti-Black. Okay.
Demando or Jason, anything to add to that?
I'll tell you just a brief story. When I was a younger person, one of my best friends, Jewish cat, blue eyes, white cat, we're at Dunbar's on Ferret Street, and just a bunch of officers came in and sat at a table next to us. And I just stopped talking, right? And he leaned over to me and he's like, "What's up? What's going on?" And I was like, "I don't know why." And he's like, "Well, you stopped talking. Like, we were having this great conversation. You just stopped talking." And I was like, "Oh, I didn't realize it. I just got tight when all these police came in." And he's like, "Why? You didn't do anything wrong." And I was like, "I know, but when they see me, they see a problem, right? When they see you, they see someone in need of protection." And that is just my inherent belief. And I watched my 6-year-old back away from a police officer that I was friends with when I was trying to introduce him. And he's like, "Well, whenever we come home from school, that's who I see putting people on the car." And so there is just this belief that the browner your skin is, that you are the problem or you are the criminal thing, right? And it's been 300 years of systemic planning to make institutions and people think this way. So we have to have, to the earliest point, I think someone made it, I think it was you, Kate, we have to have that structural institutional rethinking to get beyond that. And everybody has to admit that it's happening, whether you participate in it or not. It is real. And to think, and if you say to a kid it's not real because you're a colorblind teacher, that kid's going to know that you're not on the level with them for the rest of the year.
Damon, I'm going to give you a last word on this, and then we have time for my last question before we're out of time.
I don't have anything to say.
So I have one last question for y'all, and thank you guys so much for your time and for your thoughtfulness. So this last question is about I think one of the more telling pieces of data in the report. So 4 out of 5 New Orleans students reported that they expect to attend college. However, data shows that only 4 out of 5 will even graduate from high school. And out of those, only 3 out of 5 of them will enroll in college immediately after graduation. And then to take that even a bit further, our data on college retention after the first year in college, let alone graduating from college, is pretty bad. So what is this discrepancy between what our students' expectations of where they're going to make it and what we are actually seeing is the product of our schools and the way that we school these kids? What is that discrepancy in that data say to you? And I see Damon immediately had something, so I'm going to let him go.
I've been thinking about this for a little bit, because I have a twin brother. He's not like involved in most of the things that I'm involved in, but he's also trying to navigate this college process. And even though me being a part of organizations like College Track and having policy and all these things, I'm still running into a whole bunch of barriers that is keeping me from getting to college, and it has not been a smooth transition. And I can only imagine how difficult it could be for people who don't have these supports, like my brother, for example, because he texts me and asks me, "Hey, Damon, how do I apply for financial aid, or how do I send an email or something like that?" And we had what do they call it? A counselor who tried to, support us through all of this, but it was only one person, and I'm pretty sure she was stretched in, taking care of over 100 kids, trying to get them to college and make sure all these stuff is straight. I think we need to build more. I think we just need to have better support for young people, have individual counselors to make sure that that everybody's getting what they need done. So yeah.
Jason?
just, I guess, layering on what Damon was just laying out for us, take his experience with the experience of the elite in Hollywood being able to spend money to get their kids into an Ivy League school and having every on-ramp available, right? And that's all you need to know about how just how inequitable that process is. And then I think about just easy low lifting hacks. There are unused golf, unused tennis scholarships in colleges all across the country, but yet we have not come up with the scheme to start putting rackets and golf clubs in kids' hands just to use it. And I'm not just saying, but that's a scholarship. And there's so as opposed to a school resource officer or a metal detector, which are all very expensive, why not add the extra supports there so that kids can get that help they need? Because it's hard when you got two parents navigating this thing, let alone every other trap in your way. So resources need to go to fixing that problem, as well as those resources need to be present, to your point, Kenny, a year in, because it's not just freshman year, it's being able to make it through the whole 4-year program, or 5, however long it takes.
Rashida?
I was just gonna say that obviously I agree with what Jason and Damon have said. I also think that we have to acknowledge, one, that all of the research that you have in front of you in this report, as well as many other studies, have told us that our kids are still having a different experience. So even if they have the aspirations to go to college, are they getting access to the coursework that they need to be prepared? Are they getting access to counselors that can help support them through this, that actually don't have a workload that will make that really impossible? I think about my work at college admissions at the top of my career. I was working with college counselors that were paid for by wealthy white people versus going to Black schools and they didn't have any of that, right? Like this process, the college admissions process, much like the criminal justice system, right? It is not built for a certain profile of people. The college experience was not designed for the kids in New Orleans. It wasn't designed for me, even though I've been to college a few times. It wasn't designed for us, right? Historically, and I'm saying that definitively. So when you look at money is often like a big factor. So if I get arrested in New Orleans and I got to deal with fines and fees, if I don't have enough money, I'm sitting my behind in jail. If I want to go to college and I live in New Orleans and I got to pay an application fee, I got to pay to make it to the school visits, I have to take time. Everything costs money. And if you don't have that, then that means that you're going to have some barriers. Not to mention, if you don't have the college knowledge, as they call it, which really means that you have social capital and people who have done what you did already, navigating you through it, it is not something that you can easily navigate on your own. So it is designed to be difficult. It is designed with a number of barriers to keep the people they intended to educate in those spaces. I want to be clear about that. So, it's not your brother, right? It's not our kids' lack of aspiration, lack of hard work. The systems themselves are problematic.
Thank you, Rashida. Katie?
Thanks. Yeah, this has kept me up for years. I think I agree with what all that's been said, and I want to add. I think as a low-income kid entering college, it is so incredibly difficult, and you're dealing with things that people around you are not dealing with. And so I can't imagine what it's like to layer on a racial piece around it, right? I think every year I've worked with seniors for 5-6 years now, and every year I get calls from my kids in October telling me I'm not ready and I'm failing. And I have to tell kids, you're not failing, we failed you. And so much of that comes down to yes, the material resources are huge. I've had kids almost not go to school because they couldn't afford a new sheet set and they were embarrassed, right? We're talking a $40 barrier, but when you don't have $40 might as well be $400, but there's also these academic and emotional barriers. I think we don't prepare kids for this moment of, do I belong here? Is this actually for me? Because I know I had that moment many times when folks are going out to dinner and you got to hit the cafeteria for like lukewarm chicken nuggets for the 48th time, you know? And I think a lot about too, are we being honest with our kids about what college really is? And are we being honest with our kids about where they really are in relation to what is going to be expected of them at different colleges, right? I always say I should never know something about a child that a child doesn't know about themselves. So when I get data back on reading levels, and let me be clear, like a lot of that data is not right because kids flop tests when they know the test isn't going to impact them in any meaningful way, which we would all do too. Damon knows how many times you got map tested, Damon, like 48, right? But I think we do know there are gaps, and we do this hokey hope thing, to quote Jeff Duncan Andrade, like where we say, nah, like just get this GPA, get this thing, and you'll be good. And so our kids walk in with some confidence and then they get popped in the mouth, right? Because we don't want to have real conversations about, actually, this is not a college level essay. This is not a college level essay. And that's not because you're not capable of it. It's because I didn't really know how to push your writing. And so I just said, yeah, cool. And I graded you on your compliance and your submission. And that's hard. Like, let me tell you, I taught writing for many years. Teaching writing is like as much magic as it is science and art. But there are ways to do it if we would commit ourselves to that, if we would commit ourselves to telling our kids the truth about what will be expected of them and where they are. It's that Stockdale paradox piece, like, this is ugly right now, but I'm not going to stop until we get you to where you need to be. But that takes an incredible belief in children, and it takes a strong backbone, because our kids will meet the expectation, low or high, every single time. But we have to believe it for them sometimes until they can believe it enough for themselves. But we can't do that if we're denying the reality of the situation and not having conversations about what does it mean to be at a PWI and how damaging that's going to be. So you've heard it before when you get there and experience it for the first time. Our kids should really experience most of these really challenging things with us their senior year of high school, while they still have us as a safety net, so that they get some reps with what is it. Our kids are extremely resilient. The things some of our kids have to do just to get from their house to the school, it's not a resilience issue. It's a, do you know what that looks like in this situation?
Thank you for that. Last word over to you, Nalia.
I completely agree. Thank you, Katie, for what you shared. I want to share two things. One is that, a lot of these schools like to tag on college preparatory onto their names, but they're not college prep. I'm working with a young woman right now who graduated from a school in New Orleans, and she's in college right now. And she was like, no one told me that I was only going to have 3 grades for this one class. Whereas up until I graduated from high school, I had several ways, multiple ways to manipulate my grade, right? I had a whole bunch of tests and quizzes and homework and attendance and class participation. Now I'm in college. I have a midterm, I have a final, and I have a participation grade, and that's it. And so there's things that on the school level, if you're really preparing young people for college, that it should not be a surprise to a young person when they go in that they have to do a 5-page paper or a 7-page paper, that they only have 2 or 3 grades for this semester. We should be preparing them for what that looks like earlier on. The second thing is that everyone, and Rashida has brought this up, is that everyone is not having the same experience across public schools in New Orleans. I've heard of kids at Lusher who the major schools, they come to Lusher and set up shop and let them know that Ivy League so-and-so and top tier so-and-so is here to support you to apply to our school, right? They don't have any access barriers to the quote unquote top schools in the nation. They come to them. I think this is an opportunity where the larger system, where NOLA public schools can step in and ensure equity in this area, for them to use their capital and their collective power to bring those resources into the schools that don't have, 2-lane professors on their board and populating their schools. So it's like, where do we look to the system to be equity drivers, where we see gross disparities across the system itself? I think we kind of, you know, there's autonomy, but I think that oftentimes we throw up our hands and not step in areas, and we just let inequities, like really gross and unjust equities, drive because, oh, that's the school. It's like, no, you as authorizer can step in and provide these citywide set of services when you know that these kids need them.
Thank you for that, Naya. And with that, we're going to have to close out because we're actually over time, but no one who's ever met me has ever accused me of being concise, so I expected to go overtime. I want to thank all of you guys for joining us and for your thoughtfulness and for the work that y'all do. Demond, congratulations again on graduating. We hope that you have an amazing experience in college. I cannot imagine what trying to start a college in global pandemic is like, but I hope that you get to have some semblance of a normal college experience at some point. I want to remind folks that you can find the full report on ERA's website. That's educationresearchalliance.org. And I want to thank them for doing this work. My job is as a child advocate at Agenda for Children. And I think the first thing you have to do when you're advocating on behalf of people is ask them what they need. And I think that we have a whole lot of data and what we've been doing in schools and school reform over the last 20 years in New Orleans. And this is one of the data pieces that we don't have anywhere near enough about. What are the children's actual thoughts themselves on their experiences in the schools? I think that we need to start centering this data a lot more. So thanks to ERA and Lindsay and her team and Doug for focusing on this. And thanks for having me. Hope this is my first one for y'all. Hopefully not the last. Thanks everybody for joining.